This is part of a video series on learning, teaching, and technology. We're going to look at each of these pieces separately, and then you can kind of start thinking about how they go together and impact each other. So starting with what is learning? What do you think? Think about your experiences with learning, maybe what you've learned today. How do we know when we've learned? Where do you learn? Do you have to have a teacher to learn? What do you think learning is? There's a lot of different opinions about what learning itself is. So some say learning is a change in behavior, and this goes along with the theory of behaviorism, that learning is a more or less permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of practice. So here's my little kitty, Amira, and I lived in a house where there was a front door. She liked going outside, but I couldn't see when she wanted to come in. So I got her a little doorbell, but she had to learn how to use it. So we practiced a whole bunch of times until she could do this.
Good job.
She always meowed when she rang the bell. It was pretty funny. Over time, doing that and getting treats, she figured out that if she wanted to come in, that's a way that she could let me know. Another way to think about learning, and this is very common today, is to think about it as information and knowledge. We get input in our heads, we process that information and store it. It's just bringing all those pieces together and it goes in our brain. Some relate this to taxonomy, where we look at structural descriptions from examples. We see a whole bunch of different examples about something and we start putting it together and understanding how things fit together. Elliot Wenger, talked about a lot of different kinds of learning, and he emphasized learning in communities, such as in apprenticeship. So if I'm going to be a shoemaker, I probably am going to start in my apprenticeship with just simple things like sweeping the floor. But eventually I might start doing more, like cutting out the fabric or the pieces and learning to sew, and then gradually becoming a more central part of that community, to where my learning is part of belonging to that community and developing an identity. You can also think of learning as having experience, making meaning out of things, or as doing things. We use metaphors for learning a lot. Metaphors we have to use to understand our world, because there's some things we just can't quite picture because they're not solid. So any abstract ideas we tend to use metaphors for. So the common idea right now about learning is that it's acquiring knowledge. It's like putting things in our heads and storing them somehow. But that's not the only way to think of learning, and we're not actually physically putting things in our heads. When I'm teaching, I'm not taking something out of my head and putting it into your head. It's just how we tend to talk about it. And when we talk about it that way, it makes us think of certain ways of doing it. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's just important to realize there's a lot of different ways to think of learning. So here's just a whole bunch of different metaphors for what learning is, and people who've done it in research studies, participation with stuff, thinking of constructing or putting things together. These are all different ways of thinking of learning. Anna Svard wrote a paper where she compared acquisition and participation models of learning. So acquisition is kind of like we're acquiring stuff and the teacher gives us knowledge, whereas participation is more we're discovering, the teacher's a guide, we're doing a process, and just developing through participation. So Anna Svard talked about the dangers of choosing just one, encouraged looking at both of them together. So those are different ways to think about learning. Try to keep your mind open and broad as you think of learning, so you can include this broad array of thoughts.